I used to think the easiest way to keep the peace with a neighbor was to ignore the little things, the tiny annoyances that weren't really worth arguing over. Funny enough, that's exactly how I accidentally taught my neighbor that my property was his to use whenever it made his life a little easier. Looking back now, I don't think the real problem was the tire marks on my driveway. The real problem was that silence has a strange way of sounding like permission to people who only ever see the world through their own convenience. My name is Daniel Brooks, and I live on a quiet street just outside Franklin Ridge, Ohio, one of those neighborhoods where people wave from their porches, mow their lawns on Saturday mornings, and pretend everyone gets along. Most days that's actually true. Kids ride bikes until sunset. Retirees sit outside drinking coffee while discussing football, and every driveway tells its own little story. Mine happened to be one of the longer ones on the street, running along the left edge of my property before reaching the garage behind the house. 3 years before all this happened, I had paid almost $4,000 to tear out the old cracked concrete and pour an entirely new driveway. It wasn't glamorous, but I took pride in it. I worked overtime for months to pay for that project because I planned on staying in that house until retirement. Every inch of that concrete sat inside my property line. The county survey markers proved it. The deed proved it. There wasn't a single easement, shared access agreement, or legal exception attached to the property. It belonged to me completely. My next-door neighbor, however, seemed to have developed a very different understanding of ownership. His name wasn't Gary anymore in my version of this story. Let's call him Russell Pierce because, honestly, he looked exactly like the kind of guy who always believed shortcuts existed for everyone else's expense, but never his own. Russell drove a dark gray SUV that was far newer than anything I'd ever owned. Every weekday, around 7:30 in the morning, I'd hear the familiar hum of his engine while making coffee. Without even thinking, he'd pull past his own driveway, swing sharply across the bottom corner of mine, use my concrete to complete a wide turn, then drive away as though the maneuver had been planned by the city engineers themselves. The first time I noticed it, I shrugged. The second time, I frowned. After the 20th time, it became impossible not to notice. Some days he did it twice. Occasionally 3 times if he forgot something at home. It became part of my morning routine. Coffee in one hand, kitchen blinds in the other, watching my own property being treated like public infrastructure. I kept telling myself it wasn't causing damage. Tires weren't tearing up the concrete. Maybe it wasn't worth creating tension between neighbors. But something about it bothered me more every week, and eventually I realized why. It wasn't about the driveway at all. It was about the assumption. Russell never looked toward my house. Never slowed down, never waved, never asked. He behaved exactly like someone convinced the answer would always be yes because he'd never bothered asking the question. One Saturday morning, my friend Marcus stopped by to help me replace a fence panel that had blown loose during a storm. As we were unloading lumber, Russell cut across the driveway again, missing Marcus by maybe 20 feet before disappearing down the street. Marcus looked over at me and laughed. Does he always do that? I nodded. Pretty much every day. He stared for another second before asking the question I'd been avoiding. Have you ever told him to stop? I hadn't, mostly because I dislike confrontation. I spent 30 years working maintenance for a manufacturing plant, solving problems quietly without making everything into a battle. That's just how I'm wired. Marcus shook his head and smiled. Danny, people can't respect boundaries they don't know exist. But they sure can take advantage of boundaries nobody enforces. His words stayed with me longer than I expected. 2 evenings later, I walked across the lawn and knocked on Russell's front door. He answered wearing golf shorts and holding a television remote, looking mildly annoyed that anyone had interrupted his evening. I smiled politely. Hey Russell, got a minute? Sure. What's up? I kept my tone relaxed because I genuinely wasn't looking for an argument. I've noticed you've been using the bottom of my driveway to turn around almost every day. I was hoping you'd use the cul-de-sac at the end of the street instead. That's really what it's there for. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind someone gives when they've already decided your request doesn't matter. Come on, Dan, he chuckled. It's just a quick turn. Takes 2 seconds. I know, I replied. but still private property. He shrugged, so casually it almost impressed me. You're not using that part anyway. For a moment, I honestly didn't know what to say. Not because he had made a good point, but because he had somehow convinced himself that whether I happened to be standing on that section of concrete determined whether it still belonged to me. I simply nodded once and said, "All right, I appreciate your time." Then I walked back across the yard. I never raised my voice. I never threatened him. But as I reached my front porch, one thought settled in my mind with surprising clarity. If Russell believed convenience mattered more than ownership, maybe it was finally time to remind him exactly where one ended and the other began. The next morning, I didn't do anything dramatic. No angry Facebook post, no complaint to the city, no private property signs hammered into the grass, and definitely no shouting match across the street. Honestly, I figured if a simple conversation hadn't made the point, another conversation probably wouldn't either. My grandfather used to tell me that the strongest boundaries are the ones you quietly enforce, not the ones you constantly argue about. And for whatever reason, that old saying kept echoing in my head while I drank my coffee. Then I remembered something sitting behind my shed, my old 1998 Ford F-150. That truck wasn't pretty anymore. The paint had faded years ago. There was a dent on the passenger side fender from backing into a trailer hitch, and the air conditioner had officially retired long before I did, but mechanically it was solid. It was registered, insured, started every time I turned the key, and, more importantly, it belonged to me just as much as the driveway did. Saturday morning, I drove it out from the side yard, rolled slowly down the driveway, and parked it near the bottom where Russell always cut across. Every tire sat comfortably inside my property line. It blocked absolutely nothing except the shortcut Russell had invented in his own mind. I shut off the engine, climbed out, looked at it for a second, smiled to myself, and went back inside. That was it. No announcement, no audience, no performance. About 30 minutes later, I heard the familiar sound of Russell's SUV approaching. I didn't even need to look because I already knew what was about to happen. The engine slowed, then stopped. A second later, I heard the backup alarm. Beep, 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 followed by the unmistakable sound of someone reversing farther than they expected. I peeked through the kitchen blinds, just enough to see him sitting behind the wheel with both hands raised in disbelief. He stared at my truck like it had personally insulted him. Then he backed all the way into the street, made an awkward three-point turn, and drove off in the opposite direction. I almost laughed, not because he'd been inconvenienced, but because I'd just watched a grown man discover a problem that had never existed until he lost access to something that had never belonged to him. 2 hours later, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Russell standing there with his sunglasses pushed up onto his head and irritation written across his face. "Seriously?" he asked before I could even say hello. "Seriously what?" I replied. He pointed toward the driveway. "The truck." I glanced behind me as though I'd forgotten it was there. "What about it?" "You parked it exactly where I turn around." I nodded slowly. "That's true." He waited for me to continue, but I didn't. Finally, he crossed his arms. "So you're just going to leave it there?" "Probably." His eyebrows shot upward. "You're blocking my route." I couldn't help smiling a little. "Russell, that's not your route." For a brief moment, he actually looked confused, almost offended by the idea that I'd challenged something he'd apparently accepted as fact. "I've been turning around there for years." "I know. Nobody's ever had a problem with it." "Actually," I said calmly, "one person has." He frowned. "Who? Me?" There was a long silence between us, the kind where you can almost hear someone's brain trying to rearrange reality fast enough to stay right. Finally, he sighed dramatically. "Come on, Dan. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." I leaned against the doorframe. "Am I? It's literally 5 seconds." "Maybe. Then why do you care?" That question surprised me because he sounded genuinely puzzled. He honestly couldn't understand why someone might object to another person repeatedly driving across private property without permission. I answered as honestly as I could. "Because every single time you cross my driveway without asking, you reminded yourself that your convenience mattered more than my ownership." He laughed once, short and sarcastic. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. "Would you be okay if I drove across your front lawn every morning because it saved me 5 seconds? He immediately shook his head. That's different. Ow! Another silence. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally he muttered, whatever. Then he turned and walked away. I figured that was probably the end of it. I was wrong. By Monday afternoon, 2 neighbors had already heard some version of the story. Apparently Russell wasn't telling people he'd been using someone else's driveway without permission. No. According to him, I had become the grumpy guy who intentionally blocked the neighborhood turnaround. It's funny how stories change depending on who's telling them. That evening, my neighbor Linda walked over while I was watering flowers near the mailbox. Linda had lived on the street longer than anyone else. She smiled and asked, mind if I ask what's going on with Russell? I chuckled. Depends what you've heard. She laughed. That you parked your truck just to spite him. I told her everything, from the first tire tracks to our conversation at his front door. She listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded once and said something that surprised me. I wondered when someone would finally say something. Apparently, Russell had developed a habit of cutting across more than just my driveway. Delivery drivers complained he'd block half the street while making oversized turns. Landscapers had watched him drive across corners of other yards if nobody was outside. One neighbor even mentioned he'd once driven across fresh grass after a block party because backing up would have taken longer. Suddenly, my driveway wasn't really the story anymore. It was simply the first time someone had refused to participate in Russell's definition of convenience. Over the next week, something fascinating happened. Russell adapted immediately. Every morning, instead of using my driveway, he drove another 100 yards to the cul-de-sac, turned around there exactly the way I'd originally suggested, then continued on his way. Watching that routine every morning made me realize something almost funny. He'd always had another option. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't forced. There had never been a necessity. My driveway had simply been easier, and as long as nobody objected, easier became normal. One afternoon, I was washing the Ford when Russell pulled up beside the curb. He rolled down his window and looked at the truck for several seconds before speaking. You really going to leave that thing there forever? I wiped my hands on an old towel. Maybe not forever. Then when I decide I want to park it somewhere else. He smirked. You know, everybody knows why it's there. Good. You think you won something? I shook my head. This wasn't about winning. Sure looks like it. I smiled politely. No, Russell, winning would have required competing. I was just using my own driveway. He stared at me for another second, clearly searching for an argument that didn't exist. That's the frustrating thing about legal property rights. They're incredibly boring. There isn't much to debate. Either the land belongs to you, or it doesn't. Mine did. End of discussion. After that conversation, he never knocked on my door again. He never complained to my face. If he grumbled to other neighbors, I honestly didn't care anymore, because the funny thing about enforcing a reasonable boundary is that once you stop feeling guilty for having one, other people's opinions lose a surprising amount of weight. Still, I had no idea the story wasn't actually over. About 2 weeks later, something happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon that changed the entire neighborhood's perspective on what had really been going on all along. And suddenly, I wasn't the stubborn neighbor with the old truck anymore. I was the guy everyone quietly admitted had been right from the beginning. About 2 weeks after I parked the old Ford where Russell used to cut across my driveway, we had one of those steady Ohio rainstorms that lasted almost the entire day. Nothing severe, just enough water to leave everything slick and shiny by late afternoon. I was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee when a delivery van pulled onto our street. Instead of trying to squeeze around parked cars or invent a shortcut, the driver simply continued to the cul-de-sac, made a clean turn exactly the way the road had been designed, and headed back toward my end of the block. It took maybe 15 extra seconds. Watching that happen made me laugh to myself, because it reminded me how strange the whole situation had been. The solution had always existed. Russell had simply refused to use it until he no longer had another choice. A few minutes later, Linda wandered over with her umbrella and nodded toward my truck. Looks like it's becoming part of the landscape, she joked. I smiled. Maybe it always was. She looked down the street before saying something that stuck with me. You know, people have stopped cutting across your driveway completely. Even visitors stay off it now. I hadn't really noticed until she pointed out, but she was right. Contractors, delivery drivers, guests, everyone naturally respected the property line. It wasn't because of sign or a fence. It was because there was finally a visible reminder that the space belonged to someone. Funny how people often need to see a boundary before they remember to respect one. A couple of days later, I ran into Russell at the neighborhood mailbox. We hadn't spoken since our last conversation beside the truck. He slid a stack of envelopes into his mailbox, glanced at me, then looked away. For a second, I thought we'd simply exchange polite nods and move on. But instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Guess I've gotten used to using the cul-de-sac." I smiled. Seems to work pretty well. He shrugged. Yeah, it does. There wasn't much emotion in his voice anymore. No sarcasm. No frustration. Just acceptance. Then, after a few awkward seconds, he surprised me. Probably should have listened when you first asked. It wasn't exactly an apology. It wasn't one of those movie moments where neighbors shake hands while inspirational music plays in the background. It was something much smaller and honestly much more believable. Sometimes people aren't willing to admit they were wrong out loud, but life quietly teaches the lesson anyway. I nodded once and replied, "Probably." That was enough. We went back to our houses, and strangely enough, things became normal after that. We weren't friends. We didn't start having barbecues together, but we became neighbors again instead of opponents. Every now and then, I'd notice him wave from across the street, and I'd wave back. Nothing forced, nothing fake, just two adults who had finally learned exactly where one property ended and the next one began. My old Ford stayed parked near the bottom of the driveway for another month before I eventually moved it back beside the shed. By then it didn't matter anymore. Russell never crossed onto my driveway again. Not once. Even when the space was completely open, he drove the extra distance to the cul-de-sac without hesitation. That, more than anything, told me the lesson had finally stuck. Looking back now, I don't think that truck solved the problem by blocking a shortcut. It solved the problem because it quietly corrected an assumption. Russell had convinced himself that repeated access somehow created entitlement. My truck reminded him that ownership doesn't slowly disappear just because someone else finds it convenient to ignore it. There's another lesson I took away from all of this, one that has nothing to do with driveways. So many of us avoid uncomfortable conversations because we don't want to seem rude. We tell ourselves we're being patient, understanding, neighborly, and sometimes we are. But if you let small boundaries disappear long enough, don't be surprised when someone eventually believes they never existed in the first place. Being kind doesn't require surrendering your rights. Being respectful doesn't mean allowing people to rewrite the rules simply because it's easier for them. Sometimes the calmest response is also the strongest one. No yelling, no lawsuits, no threats, just quietly using what already belongs to you. To this day, every time I back my truck down that driveway, I smile a little because I'm reminded that protecting your property isn't about proving you're tougher than someone else. It's about respecting yourself enough to draw a line, then standing behind it without anger, without drama, and without apology. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have confronted Russell much sooner? And if you were Russell, at what point would you have realized the driveway was never yours to use? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark interesting debates about where being neighborly ends and respecting someone else's property begins. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes good fences don't always make good neighbors, but clear boundaries usually do.